Hello all, this is NaveenPrabhu. Today we are going to look at the game between Vidit Gujrathi and Praggnanandhaa. This game featured in the Tata Steel Round 10 Masters 2022 League. They both are two Indians playing in this game. I hope you will enjoy this game. There are many complicated stuff happen in this game. Let me show you what happens in the game. The game starts with move d4, nf6 and c4, and here Praggnanandhaa goes for e6, and here knight comes to c3 and black bishop comes to bishop to b4. That is, the Nimzo-Indian Defense is on the board, and the popular choice is to place the queen here. These are standard theories they are playing in this way. You will see only standard theories in few moves because the queen actually blocks the knight from entering the e4 square. And here black castles and a3 happens, bishop captures and queen captures, striking in the center with the move d5, pinning the knight there down. Now goes for c5. Now Vidit just captures the pawn here, and here the d pawn pushes forward, and here he goes for knight to f3. Queen to f3. Actually, this game has been reached before in the same tournament, in which Praggnanandhaa was facing Rapport in this game. In that game, Rapport played queen to g3 in that move, but here Vidit has placed the move queen to f3. That is improvement in the game. Let's see what happened in the game. This position is also reached by Magnus Carlsen and while Anand facing him in 2023. That was an interesting game. Let me show you what happens in this game. Here Prag continues with the move knight to d7, supporting the knight on f6. Here he just pushes e3 and offering a trade to the d4 pawn because we have to remove the pawn and want to put our rooks there. Here he just kicks off our bishop, and the only good move is to just trade the knight here. There is no point in retrieving back our bishop. So Vidit knows that he captures the knight there, and he recaptures with the knight. And now he castles here and pins the d pawn there because the pawn can't capture here. The queen will hang here. And now he plays the move e5, turning bishop to g4 in the situation. And here Vidit just continues with the move knight to e2, dealing with this bishop to coming to g4. There is no reason that now. Now usually they will always the top choice is to place the move bishop to g4 in this situation, but here there is an improvement by Praggnanandhaa in this game. That is, he goes for move d3 and wants to kick off the knight and wants to place the bishop after the knight moves here, which will pin the queen and the rook in the situation. And as happens in the game, the knight moves and then the bishop comes here. And now we have to play an important move in the situation. I give you a few seconds. You can also try it on yourself. I hope you guys found this move. Now we need to hit the pawn in this situation because you can also say that this may put us in exchange down in the situation. After the queen captures, we have to capture, and after the bishop captures, we will capture. And this position has been really good for white. As you see the engine analysis here, it is giving a plus 1.9. This is close to a winning advantage for white. As you see the counter material, we are actually exchanged down, but the rook can come to g file, and this file may be really dangerous for black. And also our two pieces are really active as comparing to the two rooks sitting on the back rank in the situation. In the middle game, it will be hard for the rooks to activate itself. We can also trade the knight here. Sorry about that. We can also trade the knight in the situation. This will be good for us. So they both knows that. So here after the rook captures, here queen comes to a5, and here he moves the queen to g3. Actually, queen to b7 was little bit better. Queen cross b7 was little bit better. Maybe he thought too much pressure will be on the b file. After the rook joins here, there will be too much pressure on the b file. So he thought not to capture here. So he just simply moves his queen to g3 and then he captures the pawn, and here he puts the rook to d3. Actually this position has been Vidit actually asked this position before in the 2018 against Ganguly in this game. As a white, he placed the move pawn to e4 and that situation. But here he has little improvement by playing the move rook to d2, supporting the pawn on c4 in this situation. Here he goes for bishop to b6 and attacking the pawn with the queen and the bishop. So Vidit just puts the pawn to b4 and attacks the queen and asking the queen to move. And the queen can't guard this pawn because if you go here and guard this pawn, our knight is attacking. After we move, we can also put this and create a major attacking advantage on the queen here. As you see, the knight just traveled here to here in this situation. This is really good for us. And after that, he's going to anyway pick up this pawn. So Prag just returns to c8. Now the queen captures here and the bishop captures here. Now the king moves to b2 because there is a queen sitting on this line, so there will be any discoveries in that. So the king safely moves there. And here he pushes a5, wants to open out the position in this variation. Here he starts pushing his pawn here. And his plan was to push to a4 and fix the pawn structures here. It will be useful for white. Now he just captures here. Maybe a4 was a bit better in this situation, but that is okay to play the move. Bishop captures f1. Here the rook captures back and he puts his queen to c4 and attacks the rook in this situation. So the rook puts on c1 by Vidit. And now he pushes the pawn to a4. Now there is a situation by our king is little bit stuck in this situation. As you see, the black king is very safe in this situation. Our king was out of pawns in this situation. Only our pieces want to defend our king. As you see, the queen's idea was to put a check in this situation. And after the king moves, it will just pick up this pawn. We have to control this square and we have to create some safe squares for our king. So Vidit goes for knight to b1. This is better in this situation. Maybe the hinting top choice was to place the move queen to e7 and protect this pawn here. After the check, the queen can't capture. But that will create some pressure. It is better to put our knight here and guard the squares here in this way. Now he gives this check here. And the king was safely sitting on a1. There is no checks in this position. The queen can't check here and this can't be taken. And he can't able to do anything. So it is better for white in this situation. Here he wants to attack the rook to pair an exchange of rooks. So Vidit trades. And now he attacking the rook in this situation and also controlling the square c2 square in this situation so that the rook can't enter here. That's a useful move in this situation. And he goes for queen to c4 here. Now he just gets an attack on the queen one more time. And here he goes for the queen to c7 and attacks the pawn on h2. But the better move was to just put the queen here. And after the rook captures, we can even put our rook and threaten something mating attacks in this situation. It is better for black. But he goes the queen to c7 and attacks the pawn here. So with it blocks the h pawn with the move g3. And the pawn to b3 was a little bit mistake because it was just offering the pawn on a4. Maybe queen to c1 was a bit better. As I told you earlier, the rook can join easily in this variation. But anyways he played, maybe his idea was to just shift his knight in this way. But here the rook just captured the pawn here. The rooks can come to a8 because the pawn on a4 is dropped now. After the rook move, our rook can put on the a8 and create some pressure on the a3 pawn here, which may be difficult for white to defend in the situation. And as per plan, he goes for knight to d7 and want to shift his knight to c5. He comes to e4, rook to e4, and he now attacks the queen. The queen goes back to f4 and asks an exchange here. So the queen places on c5 in the situation, threatening the pawn on b5, and the queen also threatening the pawn on n6. Here Vidit just capture. This is actually a blunder in this game because the pressure is going on this direction along the queen side, but the queen is doing nothing on the king side. The capture here is very best move in this situation because the queen can't enter easily to save the king in this situation. So this is a very advantageous position for black. Now Pragg just captures the pawn on b5 in the situation. The better move was to not to capture here. The rook have to come here and guard this pawn. He just captures that and Pragg just captures. And the idea was to put our rook and attack the pawn. And we can also start considering pushing our pawn. The knight can also join here. Whereas the queen is doing nothing on that direction, which is pretty bad for white in the situation. And the only good move was to place the move a4 in this situation. And here the queen goes back and the queen comes back to f4. Vidit knows that there is no point in waiting there. We have to come back to the position. So he comes back. And yeah, the knight actually comes to c5 as I mentioned earlier. This was the plan, was the push of b6 in the situation. Now the only good move was to put a rook against the knight in the situation because we can't just put our rooks here. If does, we will just give this check and pick any of the pieces, that is the queen and the rook in this situation. That is, after the rook comes here, we can just fork the queen and rook in the situation. And we can't even put the rooks on d4. It will give a fork in another direction with the king and the rook in the situation, which is not at all good. So only good move was to just place it. And now we can't just give the check and pick up the rook in the situation because here he can just come here and after we capture, he captured and we capture back with the rook. He can just take our knight in the situation and we will have this position on the board. That is, the Pragg will have the rook and 3 pawns and Vidit will have a knight and 5 pawns on the board, which is not easy to defend in this position. Anything can happen in this situation. As you see, the position is around equal in this position. So it is not at all easy to play this position. The better move was to, after this, Pragg just goes for rook to d8. This is not at all better in the situation because he has a winning move in the situation. As you see, the advantage was nearly minus 5 in the situation. The move you have to play is rook to a8 because it will create immense pressure on the pawn, which is very hard to defend. And our idea was to just push our b5 pawn in the b pawn in the situation, which is too dangerous for white in this situation. If the pawn is opened out, we can just crush the king in few moves. But here, due to the time pressure, Pragg didn't able to spot the move. He goes for rook to d8 and now Vidit has a chance to defend the position. The accurate move was to put the rook on b4 in the situation, but he didn't spot the move. He just goes for rook to c2. The idea behind putting the rook on b4 is, that is, I'll show you the lines. If you put the rook to b4, now you can't able to play the move rook to a8. Our idea was to push our pawns forward. Now we can just defend with our queen and it is okay to play the position. There is no pawn pushes in this situation. We will just capture with the rook or the queen in this variation. So it is good for white in this situation. No, not at all good for white. It is around equal in this situation. But he didn't spot the move because they are reaching the move number 40. They are on the 36th move. It is not able to, very difficult in that time pressure. As you see, the Pragg time is just 2 minutes on the clock and Vidit have 11 minutes on the clock. So Vidit goes for rook to c2 in this variation. So it allows, now also Pragg can play the move rook to a8, but he didn't place the move. He goes for queen to h1 in this variation. h1 in this variation. As you see, the time was really low. Maybe only after the move 40 he can go for that ideas. There is very less time for calculating in this variation. Now the queen comes to b4, and now Prag just captures the pawn on a4 with his knight in the situation. If the queen captures, we can just put our rook here. The queen have to trade in this variation, and we can just capture. And so that the Prag will have just the queen and the 3 pawns, and white have to survive with this rook and this knight in this variation, which is also good to play, but here that doesn't happen in this variation. Vidit doesn't capture here. Vidit just wants to trade the rooks, so he puts the rooks on d1, d2, because the rooks only wants to go to on a8 and wants to create attack. If we trade that, then there is no purpose of the attack in this variation. So he asks for a trade here. He declines the trade and moves the rook to c8. And this is the 39th move, and as you see the clock here, Prag has only 45 seconds on the clock left. Now, Vidit didn't capture the knight in the situation. That was the pretty best move in this variation now. But Vidit just goes for queen to e7 in this variation. This is very bad in the situation. Now, there is only one move to continue the position. That is, we have to stop the rook coming to d8 check. If thus we have to trade our pair of rooks. So we have to put our queen to a8 and stop the move with this. And it's also create some of the sort of discoveries in this variation. So one of the pieces should block the path of the a file in this variation. So the rook comes to a2, and they was just searching for a win in this variation. Prag just searching for a win in this variation. So he start pushing his best pawn in this variation. The queen blocks it, and he wants to put our queen here, an idea of shifting the rooks back to the c file. As you see, the king has no moves left because the b2 square is well guarded by the knight in this variation. Now the rook was to stay on the a file. There is no purpose in moving the rook anywhere, so he just wasting moves by moving it. He just captures the pawn here, and the queen defends the f2 pawn here. The queen goes back to h5, an idea of giving some sort of checks in this variation. Here he puts the pawn to f4, stopping any check ideas in this variation. So the queen comes to f5 and preparing the check on f6 here. There is a queen trade, asking for a queen trade by Vidit. He gives a check here. Now also asking for a trade. He goes back. He just moves the rook in this variation, and he puts the rook on a8 here, trading some sort of discoveries. Now the rook blocks here, and here he puts the rook against the queen here. That is not a bad. That's actually in this position it's a bad move, because here you have to start pushing a b pawn in this variation. This may be continued like this. After this, we can just start pushing our b pawn. This is so good in this variation. We can also ask for a trade here. After the rook captures here, we can give this check, and it is so much winning for us. Because after we give this check, after it moves, we can also pick up this knight in some variations here. We can pick up, but we will lose the pawn. If we want, we can just do that. It's okay to win the game in these variations. But in the game, he puts his rook to d8 and attacks the queen. Now he asking for a queen trade. Vidit is doing this because he knows that if the queen stays on the board, it is very difficult for him to win. Something to draw the game or something. So he wants to equalize the game by trading the queens. Now Prag goes for it, and the pawn captures. And now just playing on the three weak pawns of white here. He can't save the pawn here. He attacking this pawn, he just captures here, and putting pressure on the b pawn in this variation. The knight attacks here, and the rook captures, and he captures the pawn on e3. If the rook captures here, the rook captures this knight, and it is equal game. And we will just pick up the another pawn on g3 after the king moves here. And in the final position, we will have 2 pawns advantage. This is not good. So he didn't capture. He moves his knight and attacks the rook. He gives a check, and he will just move the knight now. And you want to attack the knight. The game continues like this. And finally cutting off this diagonal from the king so that our king can march out in this way and want to pick up this pawn, g5 pawn, and we have to have the 2 pawns and win the game in this variation. Or we need to do that is to trade this both the knights, and it is easy winning for Pragg in this variation. Pragg was looking for that trade in this variation or to capture the pawn on g5. That's the idea behind this position. Now he plays a rook to d5. This is not a great move because here the king to b3 or some moves like that is okay to play, but rook can stay on that line. There is no problem in that. It gives an advantage of trading the knight. After giving this check, the king have to move somewhere, and we can just attack the rook here. And after the rook comes here, we can just put a check and trade the knight in this way. If the king moves, we can capture here. That's all. There is no point in playing this because the rook plus 2 pawns is clearly winning in this variation. After the rook captures, the rook comes to c1. Maybe Vidit just tried for a last hope. Maybe Pragg can just made a mistake in this variation due to time travel. As you see, the clock is again comes to 2 minutes for Pragg in this variation. Pragg wants to take his king in this way. The king have to move here and pick up this pawn. That is the winning idea for Pragg here. Here rook goes to a2 and he starts moving his king here. This happens. He just taking his king out in some way. This rook actually clearly cutting off the king here so that there is no moves for king to protect the pawn on g5 here. So it is very easy for him to play on. Now it's okay to take it back because we are going to attack the pawn with the rook and take our king closer. Now he gives the check. The king comes here and we goes here. And Vidit plays rook to c3 and here he goes king to g4, and the idea was to put our rook on f5 and finish the game off, because after the rook comes to f5 we can just capture with our king here. Now Vidit just goes for king to d4, and at this point he just resigned the game because he knows that the rook is coming here. After the rook trades, we can just capture with our king, and after the move, we can just capture the pawn here. And we will have 2 pawns on the board. It is not easy to stop the game in this way. So, we'll just resign here. And I hope you guys enjoy the video. Hit the like button if you like the game. And thanks for supporting this channel. Keep supporting this channel. See you in the next video. This is NaveenPrabhu signing off.